So welcome back, everybody. I hope you all survived the very grueling midterm exam. And now we're kind of turning a corner. We've learned a little bit about the different organizations you'll work with as a security manager. And now we're going to talk about your responsibilities as a security manager, first in terms of the regulatory environment. So most of you probably don't have a lot of formal exposure to the regulatory environment. However, you have exposure to it every day. So once I explain it, I think you'll understand where we're going with this. But let's just take a really basic look at what the regulatory environment is and what regulations really are. So first I want you to think about a world without regulation at all. Now, when I talk about regulations and laws, we'll stay away from things like murder and assault. Those types of laws are criminal law that generally everyone accepts that you should not be able to go out and murder someone, no matter how much they make you angry. But regulations are generally associated with administrative law. So there are a variety of government organizations at every level that have administrative law capabilities. So if you look at somebody like maybe the FCC, they will tell you that you can't operate a radio station without a radio station license. And they do that because maybe lots of people would start radio stations to play the music that they prefer. And all of a sudden the airwaves get jammed and we can't get information through when there's a national emergency. So administrative laws, like those with the FCC, tell us that not everybody can have a radio station. Same is true with things like seatbelts, right? There's a law that says you must wear a seatbelt. There is a regulation that says what that seatbelt must do. So if you can imagine that we didn't have an administrative law about what a seatbelt must do, one car manufacturer could put a seatbelt in that would stop a 300-pound man from going through the windshield on an abrupt stop, which is about what a seatbelt should do, right? Another one could make it out of paper and save a tremendous amount of money, making their car cheaper and potentially selling more cars. Or they could do it in such a way that you really wouldn't see it. So instead of the airbags coming out at a certain speed and in a certain size, you hit that abrupt stop and the airbag deploys and it comes out the size of a small balloon and it's about that thickness. You wouldn't even know that that was going to happen until you made the abrupt stop. But administrative laws and regulations prevent that from happening. There's often security components to such regulations, and sometimes they're hidden. And so, those of you who are homeland majors or minors probably understand that, there are very strict homeland security rules or regulations, laws about how you do certain things, be it immigration or weapons or trafficking in arms. All those types of regulations are very clear and very security centric. In the corporate world, the regulations often are buried in other things. So there could be a regulation. In fact, there's a banking regulation you'll look at in the reading this week that tells you how a bank must secure certain things. But you would never think to go look at that because banks are primarily, their core business is money and money management, right? The security parts that are hidden in it. And many, many other industries have the same type of environment. So you have to understand that the security regulations and standards that we'll talk about, and trade secrets even, won't be directly related to security. You have to use your ESRM partners to get in there and find out what those are. Then there's some voluntary standards, compliance programs that give you an edge as a business. So we talked about underwriters' laboratories one week, and there are others, right, that you join, or that you say, I'm going to build this to a certain standard, right? And when you say that and you show that and someone else proves it, then people have confidence in your product. So we'll go back to cars again. For many, many decades, the Volvo was considered the safety standard of an automobile. If you wanted the safety mobile, you bought a Volvo. I don't know whether that's still true or not, because I think things have kind of evened out and many are really building safety into vehicles because it's a smart way to do business. But for years they did that. But they were meeting the same regulatory requirements as everyone else. What they did was they went out and hired independent firms to test the safety on their cars, to do the crash test dummies, right, that we all see on TV, and to rate themselves against others to show that they had done it a little better. That was a voluntary standard. They had to meet the minimum standard, just like Ford and Chevrolet and Cadillac and everybody else. They just showed that they went above and beyond and had an independent laboratory certify that they did that. That was that standard they decided to meet that was set by that independent lab. Then there's some internal controls that really define your business. Those might be trade secrets, ways you do things that make you unique and customers appreciate that uniqueness, right? We'll talk a little bit about fast food restaurants, right? Kentucky Fried Chicken, they're 11 herbs and spices. When you go to a Kentucky Fried Chicken, that's what you want to taste. You don't want to go to one and taste something that you're used to and then go to the next one and it's kind of a stewed gelatinous mess, right? You want it to be standardized, and they use those internal controls to do that. So the regulatory environment really involves those things: regulations, standards, and internal controls. So a caveat before we do our definitions, and these definitions are really important, make sure you understand these, but sometimes you will find a regulation that's referred to as a standard in its title. I wish governments wouldn't do that, but they do, and they're free to do so, right? There's nothing that can stop them, so they're free to do that. But if we look at our definitions, a regulation has a clear legal consequence, okay? You could go to jail if you don't obey a regulation, and including as a business, as a representative of a business, as a security manager. If you do certain things, certain regulations, you violate them, you can be imprisoned. You're not protected because you're part of the company. If you took the action on your own, you will pay the price on your own, right? Almost always based on a national or state level, sometimes local, but for the most part, a nation or a state will do that, not just the U.S., but other nations as well. Then we have standards, and they have operational consequences. So you're not going to go to jail for violating a standard in this definition, right? The penalties are often kind of wishy-washy, right? In some markets, if you, like with lamps in the U.S., when you sell lamps in the U.S. for years, you needed that Underwriter Laboratories seal. To run a dispatch center for a profit, right? If you're going to be monitoring alarms in people's houses and businesses, you need that Underwriter Laboratories certification in order to get your license to do the business. It's a standard, it's an independent standard, and you must have that standard in order to get your license, right? And a lot of times we will use those standards so that we can bridge international laws. So for many years, if you bought a car that was made in the UK, in England, when you brought it over to the US, you had to have the window glass changed because their glass standard was different than ours. Ours required tempered glass, theirs did not. So when you had an accident in a car that was made in the UK, the glass would not go into those little pebbles, if you will, like it does with a windshield. You've seen a windshield break. Now they're laminated, so it all kind of sticks together. But even before lamination, when they broke, they would just kind of crumble into little non-sharp pieces. The ones in the UK, when they would go into glass shards and be like shrapnel, right? So the U.S. standards bridged international shortcoming, if you will. So we have regulations, clear legal consequences, penalties for noncompliance are very clear. You know, if you violate this, you can serve up to 5 years in jail and pay a fine of up to $10,000, whatever it might be, right? Forfeit, whatever. Almost always issued, in fact, always issued by a government, almost always national and state-based. Standards can be a voluntary thing that you sign up to do, but then you must do it, right? You want a competitive edge over someone else, so you say, I'm going to manufacture my products to this standard. And finally, there's internal quality controls. You self-define those, right? You say that every piece of Kentucky Fried Chicken is going to have this balance of 11 herbs and spices. If you decide one day to do 10 herbs and spices instead of 11, you will not go to jail. Oh, somebody could probably sue you for false advertising, but that's not going to happen, right? That's kind of a one-off. For the most part, if you advertise that you're going to do something and you have internal controls to do just that, every iPhone is tested before it leaves the factory to make sure that it powers up. When you say that, people will buy an iPhone because they say, okay, I know I'm going to get good quality. It's one of the reasons. People buy them for many other reasons as well. But if you know that certain things are part of the internal controls, it gives you confidence in the product. So regulations, law-based. Standards, generally voluntary, but once you sign up for them, you must meet them in order to use that designation. And then internal quality controls, those things that set you apart from other businesses that you impose on yourself to say, I'm going to do it this way because it gives me a competitive edge. So after all that, we know regulations are essentially administrative laws. Standards are things that you sign up and say you're going to do, and doggone it, you better do it or you will lose your designation on that standard. And internal controls are those things that you do to set yourself apart as a business and you do it the same way every time because that's what gives you that competitive edge. But let's put them into context and kind of look at what they do, how they operate, and why they're important to you. Really simple example here. If there were no regulations, could you have any confidence when you bought clothes? So let's just say an inch. We all know what an inch is. Let's just say in Pennsylvania, an inch is the same inch you've seen forever, but in New York, they decided an inch is about half that size. They just decide they're going to have a law that says, inches, whatever you want to call it. So when you buy a size 32 pair of jeans and you get them in Pennsylvania and they fit, and you get them in New York and they don't let you put one leg in because they're really half the size. How would you know when you'd have to buy everything in Pennsylvania where the regulation said an inch is an inch, right? But what if an Erie inch was different than a Pittsburgh inch, right? It could be that those things could happen. Weights and measures are a great regulation-based example here. You know that when you buy a pound of sugar, that you're buying 1 pound of sugar. It weighs 16 ounces, dry weight, right? When the sign says 100 miles to Philadelphia, then you know that you've got 100 miles to drive. You know at about 70 miles an hour, it's going to take you about an hour and a half to get there, and you can do your calculations. Regulations ensure compliance with the laws and ensure that we're all protected in a uniform way. That's the big thing about regulations. They really are written for protection. Now, some of them look like they are rather silly sometimes when you look at some regulations, but the basis of regulations are to protect us and to keep everything standardized in a way, in a legal way, so that we all have confidence in the things that we buy that are produced for us. So some examples of regulations. The Americans with Disabilities Act, right? That regulation was put in so people with disabilities could reach things and access things in a fair way, right? I could put as a security manager, I can put a card reader on the wall. Most people at least in the U.S., I would say, are between the height of 5'5" and 6'2". I think that's probably, some people a little shorter, some people a little taller, but that's about right. And if the 5'5" person is my average, they stretch their hand up, they can go to about 6 feet, 6'1", whatever, I guess, probably a little farther than that, maybe 6'4". So if I want to mount a card reader at 6 feet off the ground, that should be accessible to everybody. My 5'5" person can reach it. It's right at eye level for my 6-foot person. You just got to reach down slightly for that 6'2", 6'3", 6'4". Everybody's happy, except for the guy in the wheelchair who can't reach that high. The American with Disabilities Act was a regulation that came about to tell us, as a security manager, in fact, that we put a card reader no more than 30 inches off the ground, right? Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards, and be careful of the wording, like I said. It really is a regulation. Government calls it a standard. I can't get them to change it. But that is a regulation that Homeland people should be very familiar with, and corporate as well, because when we talk about chemical facilities, it's not always a chemical plant. Just about every operation of any kind, a hospital, a school may have chemicals that they use for certain things. Schools have them for your science labs. Slippery Rock has chemicals, right? It's not a chemical facility. Your operations plant, where the heating and cooling plant probably does water purification as well, and chlorine is probably used for that water purification. If that's the case, that is something that may be covered by this particular regulation. And it's all put in so that it increases the safety of the people. The CFATS is what this is. The Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standards is put in place so that certain chemicals at certain concentrations and amounts aren't accessible to terrorists. And if so, they're better protected when they sit on your property. So in the case of something like hydrogen peroxide of a certain concentration, if you have any more than a few gallons of it, you may be covered by this law, and you have to show that you lock it up in a certain way and that you protect it with an alarm system or cameras or whatever the law happens to be for that particular compound. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, security for banking facilities, I believe that that's in your reading this week. You'll see it's very specific. It has security stuff in it, even though it wasn't written just for security. It was written for banking. That whole regulation is all about, so that when you put money in the bank, if the bank goes belly up, right, bank makes some bad investments, they make bad loans, people can't pay it back, they've used your money to do that, the bank can't say, I'm sorry, you had $100,000 in here, but now we've gone out of business, so you've lost your $100,000. FDIC protects you up to, I believe, $125,000 now, and which is why when you start to put money away, you should start to think about splitting your money up into separate accounts if you're going to put it in banking accounts so that you don't have more than that. Because if the bank does go, you're only insured up to that amount by the federal government. But regulations, in this case, are all supported by a law. That's the difference. And so regulations here, you notice, the American with Disabilities Act wasn't written as a security act, but it certainly impacts you. And the other ones do as well. So understand that these regulations may not be written specifically for security, but you're going to need to know something about them. So now let's contrast a little bit with standards. A standard is normally not applicable to all businesses and not all businesses equally. If I happen to run a business that puts shoes on horses, I'm a blacksmith, I would probably not worry about having a standard that involved cybersecurity. Sure, I may use a computer to generate invoices and to keep track of health records on horses, but I wouldn't necessarily worry too much about the NIST standards, right? The standards for in this case, NIST is one of the standards that's used in cybersecurity, and NIST isn't just for cybersecurity, it's for a lot of other things as well. It's for physical sciences. But you have to understand that although regulations apply to everyone, so if we go back to our American with Disabilities Act, I have to have a ramp next to a stairway if I have a certain amount of business coming into the front door of my business. Whether I'm a blacksmith or a computer shop or a hairdresser, it doesn't matter. If I have a certain amount of business, if I have a certain size business, I need to have accommodations for those who have physical challenges. On the flip side with the standards, if the standard is, password length, right? That's a standard. The NIST, which we'll talk about in a minute, has a standard for password size. They're not going to come and write me up because my blacksmith uses password as my password, right? But they may come write me up. Someone may come write me up if I don't have that ramp, depending on the size of my business. So standards are very business specific. Okay, compliance is generally voluntary. You don't have to obey most standards, true standards. You do it because it gives you a competitive edge, or because it makes sense for your business, or because other businesses that you might want to sell to say, I only deal with people who meet this standard. Okay? That's the big thing. In some countries, you may have to abide by the standard to do business with other countries. So, for instance, if, again, you are a computer company and you are going to do business as a consultant with the company that I work for, we will say we will give you access to our network to do that consulting, but you must abide by NIST standards for passwords. They must be a certain length and have a number of capital letters and small numbers and symbols and things. And if you can't show that that's a standard that you have embedded in your business, then we won't hire you as a consultant. So it might give you that competitive edge and allow you to do business with more customers. It can be as important to a business as the legal regulations if you're talking about revenue, because if you don't meet a standard, people won't necessarily do business with you. I won't buy a lamp unless it has a UL sticker on it because I want it to be safe for my family. So you lose business if you don't have one. You don't have to, if you're a lamp maker, do that necessarily, but I'm not going to buy it. Standards are not supported by federal or state law, but they may be used to comply with laws in other territories or countries. So, in order to sell a product made in, and you find this a lot in Soviet bloc countries, products for the longest time had less regulation. Tractors made in Belarus were not allowed to be sold in the U.S. because they had components on them that caught fire. They changed and they subscribed to a standard that tested them to the same testing standards as U.S.-based ones, made them in Belarus, and then were allowed to sell them. And they sold a lot of tractors in the 1980s and 90s made in Soviet bloc countries because they decided to meet the U.S. standard and have somebody certify that. So I think we all agreed that we wouldn't be comfortable if there were no regulations. You couldn't buy anything that was a standard size. If you bought a pound of sugar, it could weigh 3/4 of a pound. You'd have to carry a scale with you everywhere, right? You couldn't buy a pair of jeans without trying them on for sure because you wouldn't really know whether they were made in Erie or Pittsburgh and whether those inches were different. But what about standards? So the standards actually add quite a bit of confidence as well. So you're all paying for a degree, and a degree with value. But what if SRU was not accredited? Okay. Could you get a job? Excuse me. Could you get into grad school? Could you get financial aid to come to school? The Middle States Commission on Higher Learning is the body. It's a non-government body, and it accredits universities in our part of the country. There's a southern states. There's I don't think it's western and eastern. They're called something else. I can't remember what they are. But there's 4 commissions, essentially, that cover the east, northeast, the south, the middle states, and the west. And those accrediting commissions have on them the deans and highly ranking professors from various universities, and they come in and do a review of the university to make sure it meets certain standards. And if you meet them, you get accreditation. And if you get accreditation, you're eligible to get financial aid from the government. Without accreditation, you wouldn't get it. You would apply, and you would put down the name of the school you were going to, and they check, and if that school is not accredited, you are not eligible for financial aid. If you get a degree from a non-accredited school because you paid for it yourself and you decided to do that, and you apply to grad school, they're probably going to say no because they're not sure of the quality, right? And if somebody is really looking for somebody with a specific degree for a job, and they find you went to a non-accredited university, they will probably say you don't meet the requirements for a bachelor's degree. There was a school called Bryan State University. I don't remember what state it was in. I think maybe Ohio, but I'm not positive. But it was not accredited, and students continued to go there. And they basically didn't get any financial aid, but Bryan State was more than willing to give them loans because they actually had an agreement with a loan company. So students were all going there on loans, and they were graduating and finding out that their degree was pretty much worthless because the school was not accredited. It was at one time. It lost its accreditation, and therefore everybody that was there had to switch to loans. It's nothing that you ever want to do, and it's nothing you have to worry about at SRU because the accreditation at SRU is solid. And it's in a constant state, quite frankly. In case you didn't know this, there are people right now working on accreditation, even though it only comes up every couple of years to get reaccredited. There are people that work on it on a regular 40-hour-a-week basis at SRU to make sure that we don't lose accreditation so that you don't lose the value of your degree. So would you be confident if we didn't have standards? I wouldn't be if I were you, because you're buying a degree, essentially, that has an accreditation that is a standard, and it's the thing that tells employers that it has value, that it's been tested, that it's been examined by someone who knows what they're doing and says it works, it meets that standard. So some examples of some standards. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, it's a non-regulatory government agency. So they can't make administrative law, they can't make regulations. But they develop metrics and standards to help drive innovation in the US, right? If our innovations, if our inventors, if the people who are making products all do them to a higher standard, it is better for our economy. Those products have more value around the world. Again, think about some of the products you can buy, and if they're made in the US, some people say they have better quality. Many times it's because they meet a certain standard. We'll go back to those lamps with the UL listing. If you buy a lamp without a UL listing somewhere in, Sub-Saharan Africa, not counting South Africa, you will tend to find products that don't have the standards, right? If you find the products at all. I would not buy a lamp and bring that in my house because there's a danger of fire. It has not been, the design of that lamp has not been tested and proven to show that it does not catch fire. So, NIST is a government agency that helps develop those types of standards and will give you that seal of approval. You don't have to do it. Now, I used NIST as an example of passwords. When you go somewhere and it says, okay, enter your password, think of a password, right? And you have to put in 27 numbers, 31 letters, an exclamation point, a couple of quotation marks, and symbols that you've never seen before, right? I think one of the big ones was Homeland Security, actually. If you have any kind of a clearance in Homeland Security, they're going to give you a password requirement that's longer than anything you're ever going to use, right? Sometimes they'll even make them up for you and just embed the thing. NIST is the one who sets the standards for things like that. But it gives assurance to people that the accounts you're going into with that password are more secure. So NIST does passwords, but don't get confused. NIST does a lot of other things besides just passwords and cybersecurity type things. They also do metrics and standards for science going on all around the U.S. The International Organization for Standards, okay, which is really odd because they do the ISO standards, ISO, even though it's the International Organization for Standardization, right? The name is the initials used, right? Is the acronym used is not the same as the initials. It's an independent, non-governmental organization which has standards for just about everything. So when you go to buy equipment for your security program and it says it meets ISO standard whatever, you can go look up that number and it will tell you what tests that particular material or thing you're going to buy can pass. So you know that it's, rated for heat, it's rated for fire, it's rated for explosion perhaps, depending on where you're going to put. So cameras that have a certain ISO designation to them for explosives aren't really, people say they're non-explosive cameras. Doesn't mean they don't blow up, it means they don't cause explosions. The internal workings are sealed such that they don't create a spark. Well, if you're going to put that in a factory where you're making gunpowder, you probably want something that meets the ISO standard for an explosion-proof camera, something that's not going to cause an explosion. So again, these are standards. You don't have to make your products with those, but when you do, it tells people that they meet certain quality and certain requirements, and it makes them more comfortable. So it is a huge competitive advantage for companies that sign on to these standards. And finally, we have internal controls, and these are self-imposed. These are very company-specific. It creates a competitive edge in a lot of cases, just as a standard would, but it also promotes consumer confidence, right? So think of we'll go back to KFC, the 11 herbs and spices, great internal control. They make sure it's the same every time. So when you go to a KFC, that piece of chicken, whether you like it or not, tastes exactly the same. Trade secret protections sometimes will help you with your internal controls, but it's a very high burden of proof. And there's an article you'll read this week on trade secrets. They're very wishy-washy. That really is dependent on how you set it up. You can have a trade secret. You're better off putting a patent on it. Then you have some patent protection. But for the most part, trade secrets are pretty easy to break once you have the product out there. Reverse engineering is pretty easy. For instance, let's go back to that 11 herbs and spices, right? It's a great example. Once you have that piece of chicken, you can pretty much tell what's in there. And if you want to put that piece of chicken in a mass spectrometer and test that coating, it will tell you exactly what spices are in there, and herbs and spices, and what amounts they are, and you can make it at home. There's no question. It's a trade secret. It was initially, but it really isn't all that protected. And does KFC worry about me breaking the code for their 11 herbs and spices? Not really. New Coke. Back, most of you are probably too young to remember New Coke, but Coca-Cola had the same formula for 100 years, 100 plus years. And back in the mid-1980s or so, they came out and they said, New Coke. Everything's going to be New Coke. And they brought out this new product with a different taste, and the public soundly rejected it. And when they decided to do away with New Coke and go back to their original formula, there were a lot of tests of whether or not that original formula was protected as a trade secret. Since Coca-Cola had given it up, others reversed engineered it and used it and made things that tasted just like Coke. And frankly, they lost a lot of ground and a lot of business switching from one formula that was very popular, quite frankly, for 100 year plus, to this new formula, which no one adopted. And then when they tried to go back, their trade secret was less protected. But the internal controls tell us that things taste and look the same. I know when I buy Levi's that I'm going to have a little red tag on the back, and then there's going to be a patch on the back that tells everybody what my waist size is, which is truly not fair. But I know that that's going to happen when I buy Levi's. But there's no legal reason that Levi's needs to do that. There's no standard that. It's an internal control so that every pair of Levi's looks the same. And internal controls can be very helpful with your consumer base, and they actually need some form of protection as well when they're in production so that others don't take your trade secret and try to use it. So examples of internal controls, we talked about the first one, Nike. The standard markings on a Nike product, right? The Nike swoosh. And there are other things. The bottoms of their shoes have about 4 or 5 different tread patterns based on what sport. But those are, unique to Nike. And they might be copyrighted. But it's very hard to prove a copyright infringement on something like the pattern on the bottom of a sneaker. I mean, there's only just so many patterns you can make, right? They're not really like a fingerprint. I mean, you've either got the ones like you have on hiking boots or the ones like you have on certain shoes, or they're smooth on the bottom. You know, what about a shoe like, gosh, I'm trying to think who makes shoes with a smooth bottom. Minnetonka moccasins have a smooth bottom. I can make a shoe in my shoe factory with a smooth bottom, and it's not copyrighted, and, you know, it's just the way it is. Slippery Rock University has a standard on the seal and the word mark. The university seal looks a certain way. And if you go online and go to the university's website and try to look at use of university word marks or the university seal, there is a web page, and there are several documents dedicated to how you may display the Slippery Rock name in business cards, on stationery, in articles for magazines, all different ways, because they don't want somebody to invent a new way of using that logo. But other than the copyright, if someone were to copyright it or infringe on it, start a new university, call it Slippery Rock, and use our logo, I'm really not going to go to jail if I make a tie-dye t-shirt and use a big crayon and write SRU on it, right? I really haven't infringed on it. But that internal control makes sure that people know that when they buy a sweatshirt, if you will, that has the university seal on it, that it's a sanctioned seal, that some of the money goes back to the university, for one thing, and that it's a standard, right? I mean, it's an internal control. We control that. You're not going to jail if you use it differently, but if you are associated with the university, you are bound to do it that way so that we have some standardization. So, regulations, law-based. Standards, usually a secondary company or agency that helps you set that standard so you can show that you do things to a high degree of quality. Internal controls, so that you do things the same way every time, and you can show your customers that your product is consistent, and so that they know when they buy your product, they have that same consistency. So why is this all important for a security manager? Well, there's a very high likelihood that you're named somewhere as the legally responsible person for carrying out a regulation somewhere. So in hospitals, there is a regulation on the control, obviously, of controlled drugs, right? I mean, a hospital has fentanyl. We all know what fentanyl is, right? It is a synthetic heroin is what it is, quite frankly. And but it is used in the medical community and used a lot in surgeries. Well, your hospital, if you are the security manager of the hospital, has fentanyl, has to protect it in a certain way in accordance with the 21 CFR Part 1300, which tells you how you protect controlled drugs. Somewhere in an internal document, someone has said the security manager will certify annually that it's being stored correctly, or something like that. Okay? Someone named you in an internal document that you're going to do something, and you will never know it unless you ask. For that reason, you need to understand all the regulations that govern security practices and other practices for your organization. If you don't know what regulations your organization falls under, you'll never be able to look to see if there's a security component that somebody has tagged your name to. Same with standards and internal controls. They may not be as specific to security functions, but there could be security components that you've been named in. For instance, an internal control in certain pharmaceuticals is that our packaging will look the same. We don't want our packaging to look any different on any time you buy our product. Why? Well, first off, because counterfeiters counterfeit pharmaceutical products all the time. They put them in different cartons, and if you go to the store or if you're buying it, on a street corner from a vendor in some foreign countries, many foreign countries, you go to buy aspirin, you're buying it from a street vendor, right? And you look at the packaging, you say, that doesn't look like the packaging for Bayer aspirin at all. I know that it's yellow and it has a little cross on it, and it doesn't look like this at all. I'm not going to buy that. It's probably counterfeit. But if the packaging looks right, you're better off to buy it, right? You're more likely to buy it. And so those internal controls may say that the packaging for that aspirin gets protected just as well as the aspirin does, because we don't want that packaging going out and being used by those people to put fake aspirin in the box and sell it to you at a big profit. You need to understand the standards and internal controls across your enterprise, and they really might surprise you. And there's really only one way to do that, and I think you know how. So how do you know what you don't know? You have to ask. And when you ask, it's really the same thing as that ESRM model. It's paying big dividends now, because you're going to take the opportunity to meet with everybody, talk about their risks. Now you've opened up a conversation with them, and you can ask them about what things in their organization have a security flavor to them. right? Part of that risk assessment that you do needs to include the regulatory, the standards, the internal quality controls, and identifying what those are to see if there is a security component. So let's get into that just a little bit and figure out how you can ask about that. So here are 3 big questions to ask when you're doing your ESRM interviews with the leaders from the different departments in your organization. Ask them if their function has any mandatory legal responsibilities that have a security interface or component, right? So in the particular case of a tannery, you work for Wilson's Leather, right, where they make the coats, right? And they actually have factories where they make the coats in some places in the world, I'm sure. But let's just pretend that it's in Pennsylvania. Let's go to Woolrich. Maybe there's still a Woolrich factory in Pennsylvania. I don't know if there is. But the boiled wool may require a certain chemical to keep it so it doesn't pill, right, for the customer, right? It doesn't get those little fuzzy balls on it, right? It stays nice looking. When you talk to the person in operations, or you talk to the person in the engineering department that takes care of or the safety department, let's just say, that keeps track of the chemical stock, they may say, yeah, we use a certain acid in that mix, and we have 55 gallons of that acid out back. Now you can go to the regulations and say, is there anything that covers storing 55 gallons of that particular type of acid? Does that require special protection? Is it something of interest to terrorists? Can it be used for bomb making? Is it such that it's a flammable that could be used in bomb making? The safety person is going to understand the flammability and the explosion from a safety perspective. They're going to store it in a cabinet of some kind or in a building separate if it's going to be explosive, right? So they can protect people. You might need to know, though, what kind of lock needs to go on the door and what controls do I need to have? So you're going to ask that question. You're also going to ask if the program is certified or endorsed by any accreditation firm, society, or body, right? Are there any standards? When you go talk to the IT department, do we subscribe to any standards? Yes, we subscribe to the NIST standard top to bottom, right? Everything from passwords to storage of those passwords to the storage of our network keys, right? The storage of the recovery for our network and everything. We subscribe to it right from the top. Well, there's a physical security component to that because the network keys, if you will, there's a device essentially that holds that information. It needs to be properly locked somewhere. And the NIST standards tells you how you need to control that. And it's almost as if you're controlling the Hope Diamond, I will tell you. But in order to meet the NIST standard, the physical security manager gets involved for that physical protection part of it. You wouldn't know, though, unless you ask if your IT department subscribes to that or some other standard. And then most important, ask about the component of products that are most vulnerable to quality issues, right? What's the thing that separates our product from everybody else? Because that is something that you as the security manager want to make sure you have methods in place to protect. If you don't do that, you can lose your competitive advantage. Your product becomes just like anybody else's, and you lose revenue, and that's something that you don't want to be responsible for. So a couple of other things you can look for. You can join in on self-assessment teams. Most companies will set up self-assessment teams, especially if they're subject to a regulation, because they don't want the government to come in and be the first one to tell them they're non-compliant. They'll set up a self-assessment team and say, we're going to do a self-assessment on our compliance with the federal regulation on American with Disabilities Act. You're the security manager. You normally wouldn't ask to be in on that, but ask anyway. Go along on that self-assessment and look for anything that may be out of line from a security standard, such as the height of some of those security devices that an end user needs to touch, right? You have to read. You have to read, and you have to read about security in general and new regulations that are coming out. ASIS is good for this. There are several other organizations and consultancies that will actually send you updates, legal updates for security, so that you understand the things that you have to be responsible for because they change. A lot of large firms will use their legal department, and somebody every day reads the Federal Register. The Federal Register is essentially a daily logbook of everything the government has changed in administrative law, and believe it or not, that thing is a couple hundred pages a day. You know, the Department of Defense has determined that we're going to use silver bullets instead of gold. The FCC has determined that an antenna more than 51 feet needs to have a light on it where it used to say 50 feet, right? Things change, and the Federal Register shows all the changes. If you are in a big company, find out who the person is who's responsible for scanning and scouring the Federal Register to make sure you stay compliant. And just one other thing that I've seen in my own career is to watch for department splits. If a department used to be one way and now it's another. If they announce that the legal and the compliance department split, it's normally because there's some legal requirement and some compliance requirement that's regulatory based. That's the reason for the split. Look for departments that split their function and find out why, and see if it was, well, now this person is going to be responsible for these regulations, and this side of the house, this new split, is going to be responsible for these regulations. A lot of times they're done that way so that they can keep assignments clear on making sure that you are compliant. And those department splits will be kind of a red flag to you. So whenever there's a department split, make sure you understand why it happened, even if you think there's no security connection, right? The janitorial department is now split into housekeeping and general services. Why is that? Well, general services is going to take care of hazardous waste. Well, guess what? Hazardous waste, there are some security requirements around hazardous waste. You'll want to work with the general services lead and your safety lead to talk about what security requirements are there. But that split was the thing that kind of woke you up to the fact, hey, there's something there that may have a regulatory flavor to it. So again, self-assessment teams really help you understand the regulatory layout. Reading and having somebody else that reads for you, quite frankly, if you're in a big company, is great for that. And then those little nuances like department splits, you just got to ask why, drill down a little bit and find out if it's something that you need to be concerned with. So just to recap, regulations are something that legally you must do. Oftentimes the regulations for your particular business where you will work will have security components buried into regulations for other things. Use the ESRM model to find out which of those regulations have security components and what your responsibilities are there. What has someone signed you up for? Same thing is true with standards. Find out if the components of your ESRM team have any kind of certifications or standards or organizations that promote a standard for their particular function, and find out if there's any security components to meeting that standard and keeping that standard and keeping that certification. Also understand your internal controls. Why do you do things a certain way? And is it a competitive advantage? And if so, is there something that needs protecting, be it a trade secret or simply the 11 herbs and spices in a barrel? This week deliverables is a lecture. We're done. Thank you. There's reading. There's a basic regulation article, an article on standards, and one on trade secrets. And the trade secret one will make you scratch your head. You'll feel like you don't know much different than you did after you're done. That's okay. We all feel that way. It's really a mushy kind of a legal environment. Just understanding what a trade secret is will be most helpful. There's a 10-question quiz. It's just on this unit. If you need anything, text, call, write. I've spoken with several of you, especially around midterm time. It's pretty painless, but if you need help, I won't know that unless you ask. With that, have a great week, and we will see you next week.